Liberal Viewer presents.
So, as a lawyer, I'm often disappointed in the way the news media covers legal issues, especially legal issues I've actually worked on, and as I discussed in my video last year that included a clip of my dog getting on the national news, I was one of many people who worked to get the Trust Act passed in California that prevents local law enforcement from turning over undocumented immigrants to federal immigration authorities unless those immigrants have serious crimes on their records. Now, as a lawyer, I know this California law does not, and even as I'll explain later, cannot conflict with federal law, but my local news media completely misinformed the public on that point, letting Sacramento Sheriff Scott Jones spread the false claim that there's some conflict between state and federal law, as you can see, for example, in the story from the CBS local news here.
Sacramento County Sheriff Scott Jones says he will begin breaking federal law, and he says he doesn't have a choice. Jones says he will release nonviolent, undocumented immigrants from the county jail without notifying federal immigration officials, which violates federal law. Jones says he will instead follow a new state law, which orders sheriffs to reduce the number of inmates in their jails.
You have to understand that every sheriff in this state will have to decide for themselves whether they violate state law or federal law, but no sheriff can comply with both.
Sheriff Jones says he made his decision after going to Washington, D.C. and meeting with federal officials.
Now, that local news story repeated the false information that the state law conflicts with the federal law 3 times in about 30 seconds, and worse, this acceptance of the sheriff's claim as fact without any fact-checking was not just a failing of my local TV news, because my local McClatchy-owned newspaper made the exact same error, repeating it even more times in the headline, in the first sentence of each of the first 2 paragraphs, and multiple times later in the Sacramento Bee Story that covered the sheriff's same press conference. And even when I posted an online comment pointing out the error, and the reporter was contacted by others as well, the only change the Sacramento Bee made in the story was to add a sentence saying, quote, "The ACLU of Northern California, which was a sponsor of the Trust Act, applauded Jones's policy change. In a statement, however, the organization argued that the law does not conflict with federal law as Jones indicated," unquote. But the Sacramento Bee did nothing to change the several places its story just accepted and supported the sheriff's premise that state and federal law conflict, even though I gave a link to a memo from California's Attorney General saying requests from federal officials asking local law enforcement like the sheriff to detain undocumented immigrants are actually just non-binding requests. And as I found later, you can even read emails disclosed by the Freedom of Information Act showing federal immigration officials themselves saying to each other that these federal immigration detainers are only non-binding requests made to local law enforcement. And the reason all these authorities agree that federal immigration detainer requests are not mandatory on officials like the sheriff is because the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibits federal regulations from commandeering state officials. As the Supreme Court held in Prince versus the United States, the federal government may not command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. And this information about a federal immigration detainer being a non-binding request made to the sheriff is much more important than just some abstract legal argument, because if the federal immigration detainers are not binding, then there's no federal law to violate when Sheriff Jones claimed,
You have to understand that every sheriff in this state will have to decide for themselves whether they violate state law or federal law, but no sheriff can comply with both.
So if following the state law does not violate federal law as the sheriff claimed there, and it doesn't, then the sheriff has no justification for not following the state law. And also, it seems to me that one of the first questions I would ask a public official saying he had to violate either state or federal law would be, so which law did you violate and how did you violate it? Yet, even if the sheriff's surprise late press conference made covering all the facts on a deadline difficult, my local media could have investigated whether the sheriff broke the law in the following days, but in what may be the worst local media failure of all, neither the Sacramento Bee nor the local CBS News ever mentioned the possibility that the sheriff actually violated state law, even though the Spanish language news included multiple stories about people held in violation of state law in jails run by the Sacramento County Sheriff. And while I don't speak fluent Spanish, I do recognize this woman, Julie Del Agua, because I met her and heard her story in English about how her husband Martin was arrested for playing his music too loud and held for days in jail and almost faced deportation, even though that California law called the Trust Act required the sheriff to release Martin. Now, it's pretty shameful that no one in the English language press in Sacramento covered the stories of these people held in violation of state law by the elected sheriff of Sacramento County, especially the media that covered the sheriff's press conference and just swallowed without any scrutiny as false cover story that state law conflicts with federal law. And that's why I made this video, which I'm going to email to the Sacramento Bee reporter and the local CBS News reporter, and you can help by giving this video a thumbs up, adding it to your favorites, and sharing it on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media, because whatever your views on immigration policy, I hope all my viewers will agree that local journalists have an obligation to hold local elected officials accountable for following the law and not just take at face value claims about the law from elected officials. But I want to know what you think. Do journalists have an obligation to hold elected officials accountable for following the law? And so far, have my local English language news media let my local sheriff get away with breaking the law?
I YouTube, you decide.